Chapter 1. The Awakening. Samuel Simeon Esquire woke to the smell of burning porridge and unfamiliar voices. His head throbbed as he pushed himself up from what felt like a burlap sack stuffed with straw. The ceiling above him was rough-hewn timber, dark with age and smoke. This wasn't his apartment. This wasn't even close to his apartment. "Easy now, stranger," came a weathered voice. An old woman with a face like dried apple peels peered down at him, her eyes sharp despite the crow's feet surrounding them. "You took quite a tumble near the Eastern Mill. Good thing young Barley found you before the wolves did." Samuel's mind raced. Wolves? Mills? The last thing he remembered was walking home from his recycling job at the metal salvage yard. Then, nothing. Just a sensation of falling through something that wasn't quite air and wasn't quite water. Where? His throat felt like sandpaper. Where am I? Little Oatmeal Village, of course. 3 days' ride from the capital city of Grits, if you're wondering. The old woman, he noticed she wore a rough wool dress and apron that wouldn't have looked out of place in a historical reenactment, handed him a wooden cup filled with something that smelled vaguely like weak beer. "I'm Granny Maple. You're in my spare room. Now, what's your name and what brings a stranger to Lobo dressed in such peculiar clothes?" Samuel looked down at himself. His jeans and company polo shirt stood out starkly against the homespun fabrics surrounding him. Lobo. The word meant nothing to him, yet somehow it felt right, as if some part of his mind already knew he wasn't in Kansas anymore, or anywhere else on Earth. "Samuel," he managed. "Samuel Simeon Esquire. I don't know how I got here." Granny Maple's expression softened slightly. "Lost your memories in the fall, perhaps. Well, you can work off your room and board once you're back on your feet. We're simple folk here in Little Oatmeal, but we don't turn away those in need." Over the next few hours, as Samuel's strength returned, he learned more about his strange new situation. Little Oatmeal Village was a farming community of perhaps 200 souls, clustered around a water mill that ground the oats that gave the village its name. The world of Lobo, as Granny Maple described it, was a patchwork of small kingdoms and free cities, with Grits serving as the capital of the Midlands Territory. But it was when Samuel wandered outside, still dizzy and disoriented, that he discovered something even stranger than his transportation to another world. A young boy, Barley, the one who'd found him, was playing with a broken metal toy in the village square. The toy had once been a horse on wheels, but the wheels were rusted off, and the body was dented beyond recognition. As Samuel watched, something stirred inside him, an instinct, a knowledge that hadn't been there before. He could feel the metal, not just see it, but sense its composition, its structure, the way iron and tin and traces of other metals were bound together. And more than that, he knew with absolute certainty that he could change it. Samuel approached the boy slowly. "May I see that?" Barley looked up suspiciously, but handed over the broken toy. The moment Samuel's fingers touched the metal, something clicked into place in his mind. 4 words appeared in his consciousness, as clear as if they'd been branded there. Melt, separate, shape, cool. Without fully understanding what he was doing, Samuel focused on the first word. The metal grew warm in his hands, then hot, then began to flow like water. Barley yelped and jumped back, but Samuel barely noticed. He was consumed by the sensation, by the pure rightness of it. The toy became a silvery puddle in his palms, but it didn't burn him. With a thought, separate, the puddle began to divide itself into smaller pools, iron here, tin there, a tiny amount of copper, even tinier traces of gold that must have been part of the original paint. Samuel stared at the separated metals, his heart pounding. This was impossible, this was insane, this was also undeniably real. "Witchcraft," someone shouted. Samuel looked up to see a small crowd gathering, their faces a mixture of fear and wonder. Granny Maple pushed through the crowd, but her expression wasn't afraid. It was calculating. "Hush, you fools. The boy's no witch. He's a shaper." She turned to Samuel. "Rare gift, that. Rarer still to see one manifest in someone full-grown. Usually shows itself in childhood." "A shaper?" Samuel looked down at the pools of metal still floating impossibly in his hands. "Aye. There's those born with gifts in Lobo. Shapers are uncommon, but not unheard of. You can work metal without forge or hammer, can't you?" Granny Maple's eyes gleamed. "And separate the pure from the impure. That's worth something, boy. That's worth quite a lot." Samuel's mind was already racing ahead. If this was real, and the warm metal literally in his hands said it was, then he'd just been given the ultimate recycling power. In a world that looked pre-industrial, the ability to extract and purify metals from scrap would be invaluable. But first, he had a broken toy to fix. Focusing on shape, Samuel brought the pools of metal together, forming them into the shape of a horse, a better horse than the original, with proper proportions and detailed features. Then, cool. The metal solidified instantly, no longer hot to the touch. He handed the transformed toy back to Barley. It gleamed silver in the afternoon sun, perfect and whole. The crowd murmured in amazement. Granny Maple smiled, showing gaps in her teeth. "Welcome to Lobo, Samuel Simeon Esquire. Something tells me you're going to do just fine here." As the sun set over Little Oatmeal Village that evening, Samuel stood at the edge of the settlement, looking out over unfamiliar hills. Somewhere in this strange world, there had to be places where the wealthy discarded their treasures. Places where broken metal lay waiting to be reclaimed. He'd built a career from recycling in his old world. In this new one, with these impossible powers, he could build an empire. A slow smile spread across Samuel's face. He might not know how he'd gotten here, or if he'd ever get home, but he did know one thing. He was going to survive. More than survive. He was going to thrive. Chapter 2. The Refuse of Riches. 3 weeks in Little Oatmeal Village had taught Samuel more about Lobo than any book could have. The world operated on a curious mixture of medieval feudalism and loose mercantilism. Nobles ruled their territories, but merchants and craftsmen held surprising power in the cities. Currency came in the form of coins, copper pennies for the common folk, silver marks for the middle class, and gold crowns for the wealthy. And everywhere there was waste. Samuel had spent his first week recovering and practicing his powers in secret, working with Granny Maple's broken pots and discarded farm tools. He'd learned that melt worked on any metal or manufactured material: iron, bronze, copper, even glass, and the rare plastics he'd found in a merchant's discarded novelty from grits. Separate could distinguish between materials with remarkable precision, pulling out impurities and organizing alloys into their component parts. Shape gave him the ability to mold the molten material like clay, and Cool solidified it instantly, saving weeks of normal cooling time. The second week, he'd quietly repaired every broken tool in the village, accepting food and a permanent room at Granny Maple's inn as payment. The villagers had gone from suspicious to accepting to downright friendly. But Samuel knew he couldn't stay small forever. On the first day of his 4th week, he borrowed a cart and a mule from a farmer named Bran Flakes. Yes, that was actually the man's name, and set out for Grits. The capital city was everything Little Oatmeal wasn't. Walls of gray stone rose 30 feet high, topped with guards in uniforms of green and gold. The streets were cobblestone, crowded with merchants, nobles in silk, beggars in rags, and everything in between. Buildings of timber and stone rose 3 and 4 stories high, their upper floors jutting out over the streets. But Samuel wasn't interested in the markets or the noble quarter. He'd asked careful questions back in Little Oatmeal, and he knew exactly where he needed to go. The North Side Heap. Every city had dumps, Granny Maple had explained. The South Side Heap was where common folk threw their refuse. But the North Side Heap? That's where the wealthy residents of the noble quarter sent their unwanted items. Things gone out of fashion, pieces with minor damage that weren't worth repairing, or simply items they'd grown tired of. The North Side Heap sat in a depression beyond the city's northern wall, accessible through a small gate that the guards barely watched. Why would they? Only scavengers and the desperate went to the dumps. Samuel directed his mule-drawn cart through the gate, paying the bored guard a copper penny for passage. The guard didn't even look up from his dice game. The heap spread before him like a treasure trove masquerading as trash. Broken furniture with bronze fittings, shattered mirrors in silver frames, candlesticks with damaged bases, a child's toy sword with a gilt handle, decorative plates cracked down the middle but trimmed in precious metals, jewelry boxes with broken hinges, still containing tangled chains and bent rings. Samuel's heart raced. This wasn't just a dump, it was a gold mine. Literally. He parked his cart in a relatively clear area and got to work. The first item he grabbed was an ornate candlestick, tarnished black but still heavy. His powers told him instantly what it was made of, brass with silver plating, and underneath that, a core of cheaper iron. He focused on melt. The candlestick grew warm, then liquid, pooling in his hands like water. Separate. The metals divided themselves, iron in one blob, brass in another, and precious silver in a third, smaller sphere. Samuel dismissed the iron and brass for now. Common metals, useful but not his priority today. The silver he focused on, using shape to form it into a small, neat bar about the size of his thumb. Cool solidified it instantly. 1 silver bar. Not much, but it was only the first piece. For the next 6 hours, Samuel worked methodically through the heap. He developed a rhythm. Grab item, melt, separate, collect the precious metals, discard the rest. His pile of bars grew steadily, silver mostly, but also copper, which held value, bronze, less valuable but still tradable, and even a few small gold bars from gilt picture frames and jewelry. By sunset, Samuel had processed perhaps 1/10 of the visible heap and had filled a small chest with metal bars. His arms ached, not from the weight, but from the mental exertion. Using his powers wasn't physically demanding, but it required intense concentration. Each use left him slightly more tired, as if he were exercising a muscle he'd never known he had. He loaded the chest onto his cart, covered it with a tarp, and headed back into the city proper. Finding a buyer was easier than he'd expected. Granny Maple had given him a name, Raisin Briggs, a merchant who dealt in raw materials and asked few questions. His shop sat in the Copper Quarter, the mercantile district between the slums and the Noble Quarter. Raisin Briggs was a portly man with a calculating gleam in his eye and fingers stained with ink from his ledgers. He looked up from his desk as Samuel entered, carrying the chest. "I have metals to sell." Samuel said simply, "Everyone has metals to sell, boy." Briggs didn't even glance at the chest. "What makes yours special?" Samuel opened the chest, revealing the neatly stacked bars of silver, copper, bronze, and gold. Briggs's eyebrows rose. He picked up one of the silver bars, examining it closely. Then he bit it. His eyes widened. Pure silver. Near enough, anyway. He picked up a gold bar, repeated the process. "And this is very fine gold. Where did you get these?" "I'm a shaper," Samuel said. It wasn't exactly a secret. Half of Little Oatmeal had seen him work by now. "I extract pure metals from scrap." From scrap. Briggs's tone was skeptical, but his eyes were locked on the gold. "These aren't stolen? I gathered them from the north side heap. You can check with the gate guards if you like. I'm legitimately salvaging." Briggs was quiet for a long moment, his merchant's mind clearly working through the implications. Finally, he nodded. "I can offer you 15 silver marks for the lot." Samuel had no idea if that was fair, but Granny Maple had warned him, "Take what you can get the first time, learn the market, negotiate better next time." "Done," he said. Briggs counted out 15 silver coins, each one stamped with the profile of some noble Samuel didn't recognize. Samuel pocketed them, feeling their weight. Back in Little Oatmeal, a room and meals for a week cost 3 copper pennies. A silver mark was worth 100 copper pennies. He just made more money in one day than most villagers saw in 6 months. "Bring me more if you can," Briggs said as Samuel turned to leave. "Pure metals, especially gold and silver, are always in demand. I can offer better prices for larger quantities." Samuel nodded and left. Outside, the evening streets of Grits were coming alive with lamplight and activity. He could hear music from a tavern, smell roasting meat from a food stall, see well-dressed couples strolling arm in arm. This world had wealth, it had waste, and he had the power to turn one into the other. As he drove his cart back toward Little Oatmeal Village through the gathering darkness, Samuel's mind was already planning his next trip. The North Side heap was just one dump in one city. According to Granny Maple, there were other cities in the Midlands Territory. Cream of Wheat, a manufacturing town to the east, Porgeport on the coast, Farina Falls in the mining region, each would have their own wealthy quarters, each would have their own dumps. Samuel smiled into the night. He'd found his place in this world, not as a hero, not as a warrior or a wizard, as a recycler, the best damned recycler Lobo had ever seen, and he was just getting started. Chapter 3. The Root of Fortune. 2 months into his new life, Samuel had established a routine that would have seemed impossible back in Little Oatmeal Village. He'd moved his base of operations to Grits proper, renting a small warehouse near the copper quarter with his earnings. The space was perfect, large enough to store his growing collection of salvaged materials, close enough to Raisin Briggs's shop for easy transactions, and obscure enough that curious eyes didn't pay much attention to the steady flow of scrap going in and precious metal bars coming out. His relationship with Briggs had evolved from transactional to something approaching partnership. The merchant had stopped asking questions about Samuel's sources and started providing information instead. Which metals were fetching premium prices, which nobles were commissioning large projects that required raw materials when demand was high. But Samuel had learned that Grits alone couldn't sustain his operation indefinitely. The north side heap replenished slowly, and he'd already processed most of the easy pickings. It was time to expand his route. He stood now in his warehouse, studying a hand-drawn map he'd purchased from a cartographer's shop. The Midlands territory spread across the parchment like a patchwork quilt, dotted with cities and towns whose names still made him smile despite their whimsical nature. To the east, Cream of Wheat, a manufacturing center known for its smithies and craftsmen. Population around 5,000, wealthy merchant class, probably an excellent dump. Southeast, Cookie Haven, a smaller city built around a famous bakery district. Odd name, but Granny Maple had mentioned it was where nobles sent their children to learn refined arts. Rich families meant quality waste. South, Muesli Crossing, a trade hub where 3 rivers met. Goods from across Lobo flowed through there, which meant broken merchandise and discarded packaging. And northwest, Grape Nuts Ridge, a mining town in the foothills. Less promising for noble waste, but miners broke tools constantly, and broken tools meant scrap metal. Samuel traced a circular route with his finger. Grits to Cream of Wheat, 3 days by wagon. Cream of Wheat to Cookie Haven, 2 days. Cookie Haven to Muesli Crossing, 2 days. Muesli Crossing back to Grits, 4 days. With a day or two in each city to work the dumps, he could complete a full circuit in about 3 weeks. The warehouse door creaked open. Samuel looked up to see a young woman enter, dressed in practical traveling clothes, leather breeches, a sturdy tunic, and boots that had seen serious mileage. She had dark hair pulled back in a braid and eyes that assessed him with unsettling directness. "Samuel Simeon Esquire?" she asked. "That's me." Samuel set down the map. "Can I help you?" "I'm Quinoa Steele. Raisin Briggs sent me." She stepped further into the warehouse, her gaze sweeping over his operation, the sorted piles of processed metals, the chest of bars ready for sale, the tools he'd acquired. "He says you're planning to expand your salvage route beyond Grits. News travels fast. Briggs talks when he's drunk, and he's been drinking a lot lately, celebrating his profits, I'd guess." Quinoa pulled out a stool and sat without invitation. "Here's the thing. You're good at what you do. Shaping metals, extracting value from trash, but you don't know the roads, you don't know which city guards to bribe, and you don't know which dumps are controlled by local scavenger gangs who'll slit your throat for poaching their territory." Samuel frowned. "Scavenger gangs? You've been lucky in Grits. The Northside Heap is considered cursed, old noble superstition about touching the discarded things of the wealthy, bringing bad fortune. So the gangs avoid it, and you've had free picking." She leaned back against the warehouse wall. "But in Cream of Wheat? Cookie Haven? Those cities have organized operations. You show up with a wagon and start processing their dumps, you'll have problems. And you're here too? Offer my services as a guide and negotiator. I know the routes, I know the people, and I know how to smooth over territorial disputes." Quinoa pulled out a knife and began cleaning her fingernails with it. A casual gesture, but Samuel noticed the blade was well maintained and sharp. "I take 20% of your profits for my services." That's steep. That's fair. You keep 80% of something versus 100% of nothing when you're robbed blind or worse." She looked up from her knife work. "Plus, I can help you spot the good salvage. You're new to Lobo. You don't know what's valuable here beyond the obvious metals. There are materials you've probably been discarding that fetch good prices if you know the right buyers." Samuel considered. He'd been planning to make the circuit alone, relying on his powers to protect him if necessary. But Quinoa had a point. He was an outsider to this world, still learning its rules and dangers. "How do you know Briggs?" He's my uncle. Well, sort of. My mother's cousin's husband. Quinoa shrugged. Family's complicated. Point is, he trusts me, and he thinks you're sitting on a gold mine if you don't get yourself killed expanding too fast. And what's your background? Why should I trust you? Fair question. Quinoa sheathed her knife. I've been running salvage and trade routes for 5 years. Started when I was 16, working for my father's shipping company. Learned the roads, made connections, figured out how to talk to gang bosses and city officials. When my father died 2 years ago, I went independent. I know every major dump from here to the coast, and I know which ones are worth your time. Samuel studied her. There was a competence in her bearing that reminded him of the best workers he'd known back in his old world, people who didn't waste time on nonsense and delivered what they promised. 15%, he countered. 18, and I cover my own food and lodging on the road. Done. Samuel extended his hand. Quinoa shook it firmly. When do we leave? She asked. 3 days. I want to make one more run through the north side heap here, convert what I can to bars, and stock up on supplies. Good. That gives me time to arrange our route properly. Quinoa stood. We'll want to avoid the main roads where possible. Fewer tolls, fewer questions. And I'll send word ahead to a few contacts in Cream of Wheat. There's a dump outside the city walls used by the Smiths' quarter. They won't care if we work it, as long as we pay a small fee to the local boss. A fee? Cost of doing business. You'll find every territory has its own rules. Quinoa moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. Your powers, can you work with materials besides metal? Glass, ceramics, some plastics if they're manufactured. Why? Because there's a glassworks in Cookie Haven that dumps broken pieces by the cartload. If you can salvage quality glass, there's a buyer in Moosley Crossing who pays premium for pure silica. He makes optical lenses for noble spectacles. Samuel felt a familiar thrill of opportunity. He'd been so focused on precious metals that he hadn't fully considered the other materials his powers could process. I can work with glass, he confirmed. Quinoa smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. Then we're going to make a lot of money, Samuel Simeon Esquire. I'll see you in 3 days. Dawn departure. After she left, Samuel returned to his map. The route looked different now, not just a series of destinations, but a network of opportunities. Each city had its own waste streams, its own inefficiencies, its own overlooked treasures. He thought about his old life, working at the salvage yard, sorting endless bins of scrap for minimum wage. He dreamed then of running his own operation, of having the freedom to pursue the most profitable materials, of building something that mattered. This world had given him that chance, not in the way he'd ever imagined, but perhaps in a better way. Here, his skills were rare and valuable. Here, he had powers that made the impossible routine. Samuel picked up a piece of scrap copper from his current pile and focused on it. Melt, separate, shape, cool. The copper flowed through the sequence effortlessly, becoming a small, perfect bar stamped with his initials, a maker's mark he'd started adding to his work. In 3 days, he'd begin the first circuit of what he was already thinking of as his salvage empire. City by city, dump by dump, he'd extract value from what others threw away. It was exactly what he'd always wanted to do, just in a world called Lobo, where breakfast foods named the cities and a man with impossible powers could turn trash into treasure. Samuel smiled and got back to work. He had 3 days to prepare, and he wasn't going to waste a single hour. Chapter 4. The Circuit Begins. The road to Cream of Wheat wound through rolling farmland and scattered forests of birch and oak. Samuel sat on the driver's bench of his wagon, larger now than the cart he'd borrowed that first trip, while Quinoa rode alongside on a sturdy mare the color of honey. They'd left Grits at dawn 3 days ago, and Samuel had quickly learned that Quinoa's fee was worth every copper. She'd navigated them around 2 toll stations by using overgrown side roads, negotiated passage through a noble's private land with a combination of charm and a small bribe, and warned him away from a seemingly innocent campsite that she said was known bandit territory. You would have been robbed by morning, she'd said matter-of-factly when Samuel questioned how she knew. They wait for lone travelers, offer to share their fire, then slit throats when everyone's asleep. Lost a shipment that way before I learned better. Now, as the walls of Cream of Wheat came into view on the horizon, Quinoa pulled her horse alongside his wagon. "Few things you need to know before we enter," she said. "Cream of Wheat is a smith's city. Half the population works in the foundries and forges. They're proud people, and they don't like outsiders implying their work is wasteful." "So I shouldn't mention I'm here to salvage their scraps?" "Exactly. Our story is you're a shaper looking to purchase raw materials for a private commission. I'm your agent. We'll pay our respects to the Smiths Guild. Maybe commission a small piece, a knife or something, to show good faith. Then we visit the dump outside the western wall." Samuel nodded. He'd learned not to question Quinoa's guidance on these matters. Cream of Wheat was smaller than Grits, but more densely built. The walls were blackened with soot, and the air smelled of coal smoke and hot metal. The steady ring of hammers on anvils created a rhythmic backdrop to the city's normal sounds. Quinoa led them to a modest inn called the Cooled Ingot, where she clearly knew the proprietor, a scarred older man named Buckwheat Tom, who gave her a warm embrace, and Samuel a suspicious once-over. "He's with me," Quinoa said simply, and that seemed to settle the matter. After securing their rooms and stabling the horse, Quinoa took Samuel to the Smiths Guild, a massive stone building near the city center. Inside, the walls were decorated with examples of masterwork: swords, armor, decorative gates, intricate clockwork mechanisms. The guildmaster, a woman named Cornelia Flax, with arms like tree trunks and silver streaking her black hair, received them in her office. "Quinoa Steele," Cornelia said, her voice rough from years of breathing forged smoke. "Haven't seen you since the incident with the Porridge Port shipment." "That wasn't my fault, and you know it," Quinoa replied with a grin. "But I brought payment anyway." She placed a small pouch on Cornelia's desk. Cornelia opened it, examined the silver coins inside, and nodded. "Debt's paid, then. What brings you to Cream of Wheat?" "My associate Samuel is a shaper. He's been commissioned to create some specialized pieces and needs quality raw materials. I thought your smiths might be willing to sell some stock metal, and perhaps Samuel could commission a demonstration piece to show his capabilities." It was a beautiful lie, Samuel thought. Not technically false. He could create specialized pieces, but carefully worded to avoid mentioning dumps or salvage. Cornelia studied Samuel with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent a lifetime evaluating metal and the people who worked it. "You're young for a shaper. What's your specialization?" "Purification and reformation," Samuel said, sticking to the script Quinoa had coached him on. "I can extract pure metals from complex alloys and reshape them with precision. Show me." Samuel had expected this. He pulled out a piece of scrap he'd brought specifically for demonstration, a broken bronze buckle with iron rivets and tarnish obscuring its original luster. He held it in his palm and focused. Melt. The buckle liquefied, drawing a sharp intake of breath from Cornelia. Separate. The molten metal divided into distinct pools: bronze, iron, and tiny amounts of tin and copper that had been part of the alloy. Shape. Samuel formed the bronze into a small rose, complete with layered petals and a thorned stem. It was a design he'd been practicing in his warehouse. Cool. The rose solidified, gleaming like new minted metal. He offered it to Cornelia, who took it with reverence. She examined it from every angle, testing the weight, checking the details of the petals. No forge, no hammer, no cooling time. She looked up at Samuel with new respect. "That's impressive work. What would you charge to teach that technique?" "It's not a technique I can teach," Samuel said apologetically. "It's an innate gift, but I'm happy to commission a piece from one of your smiths to show mutual respect between craftsmen." Cornelia nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Visit my nephew's forge in the morning. Barley Grain, 3 streets south of here. He does good work with blades. Commission something from him, and I'll make sure you have access to purchase materials at guild rates." They left the guild house with Quinoa barely containing her satisfaction. "Perfect," she said once they were out of earshot. "Now Cornelia thinks you're a legitimate buyer. We've shown appropriate respect, and tomorrow we can legitimately be seen around the Foundry District. Which means we can visit the dump without suspicion." "Exactly." The dump outside Cream of Wheat's western wall was different from Grits's north side heap. It was more organized, divided into sections: scrap metal, broken tools, failed castings, slag from the furnaces. A rough-looking man with a cudgel stood at what passed for an entrance, the gang representative Quinoa had mentioned. She approached him directly, while Samuel hung back. "Grit," she said, using what must have been the man's name. "Quinoa Steel. I sent word I'd be coming through." Grit looked her up and down, then nodded. "Aye, boss says you can work the failed casting section for 2 days. Fee is 5 silver marks." "3," Quinoa countered. "We're only taking the unsalvageable pieces." "4, and you're gone by sunset tomorrow." "Done." The exchange of coins was quick and professional. Then Quinoa waved Samuel forward. The failed casting section was a treasure trove. Cream of Wheat smiths were skilled, but even skilled smiths made mistakes. Metal that hadn't flowed properly into molds, pieces with hidden air bubbles that made them structurally unsound, experiments that hadn't worked out. All of it was useless to a traditional smith, but perfect for Samuel's purposes. He got to work immediately. A cracked iron cauldron became a pile of pure iron bars, a bronze statue with a flawed casting, an arm that had never properly formed, separated into its component metals, copper, tin, and traces of other alloys, failed sword blanks, cooking pots with holes, decorative pieces with fatal flaws. All of it flowed through Samuel's hands in an efficient rhythm. Melt, separate, shape, cool. The gang representative watched with open fascination as Samuel's pile of neatly stacked bars grew. Quinoa had brought several empty chests, and she loaded them methodically as Samuel worked. By sunset, they'd processed roughly a quarter of the available material. Samuel's head throbbed with the mental strain. He'd pushed himself harder than ever before, but the results were undeniable. Chests of pure metal bars, iron, bronze, copper, and even some steel that had been mixed into the failed pieces. "You're a machine," Quinoa said with admiration as they loaded the last chest onto the wagon. "I've never seen anyone work that fast." "I'm also exhausted," Samuel admitted. His hands were trembling slightly. "Then we rest. Tomorrow we finish here. Then I'll introduce you to my buyer in the city. Not Briggs's contact. Someone local who will pay fair prices for processed metals." That evening, back at the Cooled Ingot, Samuel collapsed onto his bed, fully clothed. His powers had left him drained in a way that physical labor never had. It was as if each use pulled from some internal reserve that needed time to replenish. But as he drifted toward sleep, he calculated the day's haul. 3 chests of metals. Based on what Briggs paid in grits, that was easily 30 silver marks worth of material, maybe 40. Minus Quinoa's percentage and the fee to the gang, he was still looking at significant profit. And this was just the first city on the circuit. A knock on his door pulled him back from the edge of sleep. He opened it to find Quinoa holding 2 bowls of stew. "Figured you'd be too tired to go down to the common room," she said, handing him one. "Eat. You'll need your strength for tomorrow." They sat in his room eating in comfortable silence until Quinoa spoke. "You know, when Briggs first told me about you, I thought you'd be a waste of time. Another dreamer who'd stumbled into a gift and had no idea how to use it practically." She paused, spooning stew into her mouth. "I was wrong. You've got a good head for this kind of work." Strategic thinking. "I did this in my old life," Samuel said before he could stop himself. Quinoa raised an eyebrow. "Your old life?" Samuel hesitated, then figured there was no harm in being honest. "I'm not from Lobo. I don't know how I got here, but where I come from, I worked in salvage and recycling. Different methods, but the same principle: extract value from what others discard." "Another world?" Quinoa didn't sound skeptical, just curious. "There are stories about such things. Travelers who appear from nowhere with strange knowledge and stranger gifts. You're not the first." "There are others?" "Were. Most died or went mad trying to get back home. A few adapted, like you seem to be doing." She finished her stew. "My advice? Don't waste time trying to return. Build something here instead. You've got the skills and the power to do well in Lobo." After she left, Samuel sat by the window, looking out over Cream of Wheat's forge-lit streets. The hammers still rang even at this hour. The city never truly slept. Quinoa was right. He could spend his time searching for a way home, or he could build the life he'd always wanted here. A life where his skills mattered, where he controlled his own destiny, where trash truly became treasure. The choice seemed obvious. Samuel finished his stew, crawled into bed, and dreamed of metal flowing like water through his hands. transforming waste into wealth across an entire world of breakfast-themed cities. Tomorrow he'd finish Cream of Wheat, then Cookie Haven, then Muesli Crossing, then back to Grits, and the circuit would begin again. The salvage empire was taking shape, one dump at a time. Chapter 5. The Unraveling. Cookie Haven lived up to its name in ways that still made Samuel shake his head in wonder. The city was built around a central plaza where master bakers sold their wares. Shops with names like Snickerdoodle and Sons, the Gingerbread Gallery, and Macaroon Manor lined the streets in buildings that actually incorporated cookie motifs into their architecture. Decorative tiles shaped like chocolate chips, window frames carved to look like scalloped edges, even a fountain in the town square that was supposedly designed to resemble a giant fortune cookie. Ridiculous, isn't it? Quinoa had said when they'd first arrived a week ago. But the nobles love it, sends their children here for cultural refinement, which mostly means learning to eat expensive pastries with proper etiquette. The dump outside Cookie Haven's eastern gate had proven even more lucrative than Cream of Wheat's. Wealthy families discarded items with shocking frequency: silver serving platters with minor dents, gold-trimmed picture frames that had gone out of fashion, jewelry boxes with broken clasps still containing tangled necklaces and bent rings. Samuel had spent 3 solid days processing the heap, and his wagon now carried 5 chests of precious metals. But more importantly, he'd discovered something new about his powers. Among the discarded items had been several broken mirrors, large, ornate pieces from noble houses, their glass shattered but their frames intact. Samuel had melted down the frames for their silver and gold, but out of curiosity he'd tried using his powers on the broken glass itself. To his amazement, it had worked. Melt turned the shattered glass into a clear molten substance. Separate divided it into pure silica and the various impurities, metal oxides used for coloring, tiny bits of backing material, even traces of sand that hadn't fully fused in the original manufacturing. Shape allowed him to form the pure silica into smooth, clear sheets, and Cool solidified them into flawless glass. "That's going to be worth a fortune in Muesli Crossing," Quinoa had said, examining the glass sheets with something close to awe. "My contact there, the lens maker, he'll pay premium rates for this quality. You've just tripled our expected profit from this leg of the journey." Now, on their final day in Cookie Haven, Samuel sat in the shade of his wagon at the dump, processing the last batch of salvageable materials. His routine had become almost meditative. Identify the item, assess its composition, melt, separate, keep the valuable materials, discard the waste, shape into bars or sheets, cool, add to the chest, repeat. The sun was high overhead, and the heat made the air shimmer above the piles of refuse. Samuel wiped sweat from his forehead and reached for another piece, a candlestick holder with elaborate scrollwork. Melt. The metal began to flow, and Samuel felt the familiar pull on his concentration. But something was different this time. The edges of his vision seemed to blur slightly, like looking through old glass. He blinked, attributing it to fatigue. He'd been pushing himself hard all week, processing more material than ever before. His internal reserves felt depleted, stretched thin, separate. The molten metal divided into its components, but the colors seemed wrong somehow. Too bright, too vivid. The silver gleamed with an almost artificial intensity, and the copper looked more orange than it should. Samuel shook his head, trying to clear it. He needed to finish this batch, get back to the inn, rest properly. He'd been skipping meals, working too long, sleeping too little. Shape. He formed the silver into a bar, but his hands felt strange, simultaneously too light and too heavy, as if gravity itself couldn't decide what it wanted to do. The ground beneath him seemed to pulse slightly, like a heartbeat. Cool. The bar solidified, and Samuel set it in the chest with the others. He looked up to call to Quinoa to tell her he needed a break, but she was haggling with a scavenger over territorial rights to a pile of broken furniture. Her voice sounded distant, muffled, as if he were hearing her through water. Samuel stood, intending to walk over to her, but the world tilted sickeningly. The ground wasn't just pulsing now, it was undulating, rippling like the surface of a pond. He stumbled, catching himself against the wagon. "Quinoa?" His voice sounded wrong in his own ears, echoing, distorted. She didn't turn around. Neither did the scavenger she was talking to. Neither did the guards standing at the dump's entrance. Nobody seemed to notice that the earth itself was starting to crack, thin lines of brilliant white light showing through the breaks like the world was an eggshell and something was hatching from inside. Samuel's heart raced. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't normal. The air itself had taken on a hazy quality, reality seeming to fray at the edges. The piles of refuse around him began to lose definition, their shapes becoming uncertain, as if someone was erasing them with an imperfect eraser. "Quinoa!" he shouted this time, but she still didn't react. She was frozen mid-gesture, her hand extended toward the scavenger, her mouth open on a word that never finished. Everything was frozen except Samuel. The ground gave a massive lurch, and the cracks widened. Through them, Samuel could see nothing. Not darkness, not light, just an absence so profound it made his eyes hurt to look at it. The shaking intensified, reality itself trembling like a plucked string. Then the ground split completely beneath his feet. Samuel felt himself falling, but not down, out of the world, out of Lobo, out of everything. The dump, the city, Quinoa, all of it peeled away like layers of an onion, revealing the nothing underneath. Then he wasn't falling anymore. He was rising. His body lifted into the air as if gravity had reversed itself. The sky above opened like a wound, and Samuel flew through it, accelerating impossibly fast. He passed through clouds that felt like silk, through layers of atmosphere that tasted like copper and ozone, through the boundary between air and void. Space opened before him, but not the space of Lobo. This was different, darker, stranger. Wormholes appeared in the fabric of reality, spiraling tunnels of twisted light and shadow. Samuel's body was pulled into one, then another, moving faster than thought through impossible geometries that his mind couldn't process. Colors that had no names flickered past, sounds that couldn't exist in vacuum rang in his ears. Time stretched and compressed and folded back on itself. Through it all, Samuel felt himself coming apart, his consciousness fragmenting like shattered glass, each piece flying in a different direction through the cosmic chaos. And then, Samuel, man, wake up! Samuel jerked awake with a gasp that felt like drowning in reverse. His neck screamed in protest. He'd been sleeping at an awful angle. The smell of metal and oil and old coffee filled his nostrils. Familiar smells, achingly familiar. He was at his workstation at Riverside Salvage and Recycling. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting their familiar greenish glow over the sorting area. His computer monitor showed the inventory system he'd been updating before he'd apparently dozed off. The clock in the corner read 6:47 a.m. Marcus, one of the night shift supervisors, stood next to his chair looking concerned. "Dude, you've been here all night. I came in for the morning shift and found you passed out on your keyboard. You really should go home, get some sleep. Sleeping at work the whole night is not good for you." Samuel stared at him, his mind still reeling. Lobo, Grits, little oatmeal village, Quinoa, the dumps, his powers, all of it felt so real, so vivid, so impossibly detailed. Yeah, Samuel managed. His mouth was dry, tasting of stale coffee and exhaustion. "Yeah, you're right. I'll head out." "You okay?" Marcus asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just a really intense dream," Marcus laughed. "Must have been some dream. You were out cold for hours. Pretty sure I heard you mumbling about metals and melting at one point." "Take it easy, man." They said their goodbyes, the normalcy of it almost painful. Samuel closed up his workstation with mechanical precision, logging out of the system, tidying his desk, grabbing his jacket from the back of his chair. His hands shook slightly as he did it. He stood, and immediately his bladder reminded him it had been neglected for far too long. The bathroom break was almost surreal in its mundanity. Fluorescent lights, cracked tile, the smell of industrial cleaner. So different from the rustic inns of Lobo, from Granny Maple's guest room, from the cooled ingot. Afterward, Samuel walked through the salvage yard toward the exit. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The sorted piles of scrap metal, copper, aluminum, steel, brass, sat in their designated areas, waiting to be processed. His truck was parked where he'd left it yesterday. Or was it the day before? He honestly couldn't remember how long it had been since he'd slept properly. He paused at the gate, one hand on the chain-link fence, and looked back at the yard. Somewhere in his mind he could still feel it, the sensation of metal flowing through his hands, the perfect knowledge of melt separate, shape, cool. He could almost see the piles of refuse transforming into neat bars of precious metal. But his hands were just hands. No powers, no magic, just a tired man at the end of a long shift. Samuel let out a long breath and shook his head. One hell of a dream, he muttered to himself. It had been so long without sleep, he didn't even remember which day this was anymore. Thursday? Friday? Did it matter? He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and pulled out of the salvage yard as the sun continued its lazy climb into the sky. The streets were mostly empty at this hour, just a few early commuters and delivery trucks. As he drove, Samuel couldn't shake the lingering sense of loss. In that dream, he'd had purpose, direction, powers that made him special, valuable, able to build something that mattered. He'd had a partner who respected his skills. He'd had a whole world spread before him, full of possibilities. And here he was, just another worker at a salvage yard, sorting trash for barely above minimum wage, with dreams too big for his reality and an empty apartment waiting for him. Samuel pulled up to a red light and rubbed his eyes. The exhaustion was bone deep now, dragging at him like weights. But even through the fatigue, even through the crushing return to mundane reality, a small part of him smiled. Because for one night in the space between waking and sleeping, he'd been Samuel Simeon Esquire. He'd been a shaper in the land of Lobo. He'd turned trash into treasure, built an empire from refuse, traveled between cities with breakfast cereal names, and had powers that bent the very laws of nature to his will. The light turned green. Samuel drove forward, heading home to sleep. And somewhere in the back of his mind, so faint it might have been imagination, he could still feel the ghost of metal flowing through his hands like water. One hell of a dream indeed. The end.